Picture this. You walk into the smallest country on Earth. You can cross the entire border in about 6 minutes. On foot. It has no farms, no factories, no oil, no natural resources of any kind. It doesn't even tax its own residents. And yet, this tiny country, smaller than most golf courses, is sitting on a fortune so large that nobody, not even the people who run it, actually knows the full number. Priceless paintings, thousands of buildings scattered across the world's most expensive cities, its own bank, its own stock portfolio, its own real estate empire stretching from Rome to London to Paris, a country with zero exports that somehow owns pieces of some of the richest cities on the planet. So where does all of this money actually come from? Not tithes in a collection basket, not what you're picturing. The real answer involves a museum, a landlord, a bank with a scandal-soaked past, and a financial hole that keeps getting bigger every single year. Even with all of this wealth sitting right there, let's break it down. Tourism. The Vatican museums pull in roughly 7 million visitors every single year. Every ticket, every souvenir, every overpriced gelato near St. Peter's Square, it adds up to close to $100 million annually. That makes tourism the closest thing this tiny state has to an actual export industry. People don't come to buy anything made here. They come to look at things that were made here 500 years ago. The Sistine Chapel ceiling, painted centuries before anyone could imagine tourists lining up around a city block just to photograph it on their phones. But here's the thing. Even 7 million visitors a year, as impressive as that sounds, is not nearly enough to run a country. Not even a tiny one, landlord. This is where it gets interesting. The Vatican is technically one of the biggest landlords on the planet. It owns more than 5,000 properties, not just in Rome, in London, Paris, Geneva, Switzerland. Apartments, office buildings, historic real estate in some of the most expensive zip codes in the world. You'd assume that's a gold mine. It is not. Only about 1 in 5 of those properties is actually rented out at real market rate. The rest? Roughly 70% generate no income at all because they're used as churches, offices, or housing for church staff. Another chunk is rented out to Vatican employees at reduced rates, basically as a workplace perk. So picture owning 5,000 apartments across the most expensive cities in Europe, and using most of them for free, or nearly free. It's like winning the lottery and then deciding to store the cash under your mattress instead of investing it. In 2024, this 5,000 property empire generated about $35 million in profit. That is a rounding error for a portfolio that size. The bank, yes. The Vatican has its own bank. It's officially called the Institute for the Works of Religion, but everyone just calls it the Vatican Bank. It manages several $billion in assets and quietly funds papal charity work around the world. It also has one of the messiest reputations in modern financial history. Back in the 1980s, the Vatican Bank got tangled up in the collapse of an Italian bank called Banco Ambrosiano. The fallout was so bad it cost the Vatican over $200 million in reparations. And for decades afterward, the bank carried a reputation as a place where money could quietly disappear into questionable hands. That reputation stuck around for a long time, long enough that European financial regulators eventually walked inside the Vatican itself to inspect the books, something that had never happened before. The bank still operates today. It still funds papal charities, but it now publishes financial reports. It gets audited. The secrecy that once defined it has been, slowly, reluctantly, stripped away. Peter's pence. Here's the part most people assume is the main source of Vatican income. It's called Peter's pence, an annual worldwide donation collected from Catholics across the globe, sent directly to the Pope to fund charitable work. And for a long time, it quietly funded something else, too, the Vatican's own operating budget. The number sounds significant, roughly $50 to $60 million a year. But donations have been declining for years. Fewer people giving, less trust after a string of financial scandals involving exactly where that donation money was actually being spent, including one case where Peter's pence funds were used in a failed luxury real estate deal in London that lost the Vatican over $200 million. Donated specifically for charity, spent instead on a London property gamble. That single deal did more damage to Vatican finances and Vatican trust than almost anything else in the last decade. The deficit. So here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. With a museum empire, a 5,000 property real estate portfolio, its own bank, and worldwide donations, the Vatican is still losing money. Every single year, the structural deficit sits somewhere between $50 and $60 million annually. On top of that, there's a pension shortfall for Vatican employees estimated at over $1 billion. A country that owns priceless art, historic buildings across 4 countries, and its own financial institution, cannot balance its own checkbook. How does that happen? Partly because most of that wealth isn't built to generate income. It's built to serve a mission. Priceless paintings don't get sold off. Historic buildings mostly aren't rented at market value because they house churches and offices instead. The Vatican isn't really run like a company chasing profit. It's run more like a very old, very wealthy non-profit, one that keeps choosing mission over margin year after year, even as the deficit grows. The reform. This is finally starting to change. New leadership has pushed for something the Vatican has historically avoided: actual transparency, annual public financial reports, independent audits, a real conversation about whether it makes sense to keep holding on to thousands of underused buildings instead of selling some off or finally renting them at real market rates. It's a slow shift. Centuries of tradition don't get modernized overnight. But for the first time in its history, the institution behind some of the world's most iconic art and architecture is starting to explain, publicly, exactly where its money comes from and exactly why it keeps running short. A country with no exports, no taxpayers, and priceless assets it refuses to sell, quietly running a deficit anyway. Turns out even an empire built on centuries of wealth can still end up asking the same question everyone else does at the end of the month. Where did all the money actually go?